Hey guys, it's Madison Estes. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about We're Not Home, an anthology of vacation horror themed stories written entirely by horrortubers. The first story in this collection is In Front of Your House by Cavanaugh. This story is about a girl that's on a beach vacation with her friends and she keeps checking on her house through her home security system cameras. During one of these instances of checking on her house, she notices that her next door neighbor is just staring at her front door, and it's very uncanny and weird. At the end of the story, she ends up going home and confronting the situation with her front porch, and I can't really get into spoilers because I'm not entirely sure what happened at the end of that story. I will say that it was very creepy and the premise really creeped me out, but I can't say that the ending really left me satisfied or feeling like I had conclusion as to what actually happened in that story. The next story in this collection is Not in Tamworth Anymore by Dane Cobain. This story is about a couple traveling with their baby and their car breaks down. The husband leaves, he starts walking along the road to try to get help, and then the mother waits with the baby as long as she can, but eventually she ends up becoming desperate enough to start walking along the road to look for help as well. And then the mother meets a man who is driving an old-fashioned cart on the road, and it seems as if her and the baby might be saved. Like, the guy is clearly Amish. She's gonna be fine. Like, what's the worst that can happen if you get picked up by an Amish guy? Like, he respects you too much. He takes you back to his community and you get into like a butter churning accident. So she gets picked up by the Amish guy. It seems like everything's gonna be fine, but spoiler alert, it is not fine. I don't want to get into any spoilers, but I definitely feel like this story has some very strong Children of the Corn vibes to it, even though it doesn't revolve around children. It definitely has some very strong elements of folk horror and occult horror. And the ending, oh man, it's so bleak, and I love it because if you came across this image, this final image in the story, how could you possibly explain it without knowing the context of the story behind it? It's just so haunting and creepy, and I really enjoyed this story a lot. The next story is The Cabin's King by David Decero. This story kind of reminded me of the movies The Owners with McWilliams and Don't Breathe, and that, it's about people that break into someone's house and then things end up going horribly wrong. This story also has some parts that are written really beautifully, like this part right here. Sometime when you were small and weak, you had violence put in you, and ever since you've been trying to give it away, but that's not something that you can give away. No more than you can get rid of fire by handing it to someone else. It only spreads. I really enjoyed this story. I liked the direction that the story took, and I enjoyed the writing style as well. The next story is The Ghost of Walt Whitman, and I have to admit I have a love-hate relationship with this story because although the story's good and it's written well, I absolutely hate the character. And I think that we're supposed to, but nonetheless, the story was just, it was a love-hate thing for me because throughout the story I was just like, I was so ready for this character to die. This story is about Nathan and Dolly. They just got into a new relationship and they're on vacation in New Orleans, and Nathan is very insecure that Dolly's gonna leave him, and he kind of goes back and forth between like being terrified he's gonna lose her and just being a total hornball and wanting to have sex with like every man he comes across. Dolly ends up disappearing in like the middle of the night after they have sex, and Nathan just decides to assume that she left him in the middle of the night instead of like calling her family, calling the police, trying to track her down. He's just like, oh, I guess she left me, and then he ends up cheating on her. So as you can see, there's some very legitimate reasons for hating Nathan, and I did. I hated him throughout the entire story. Like I said, it's a very love-hate thing, but it is also a sign of good writing whenever someone can make you hate a character in such a short amount of time. One of my favorite parts of the story is whenever the cops come to issue him a warning for prostitution, because he not only cheats on her, he also receives payment for it as well. He just starts literally pimping himself out in New Orleans as soon as she disappears. But anyways, as soon as the cops come by to give him a warning, Nathan says, "Sometimes I wish I wasn't bisexual," and then I love that the cop says, "Kid, it's not your bisexuality, it's the problem. Yeah, it's that you're a whore." I just love that. I love that the cops called him out. I love that they made it very clear that it wasn't just like an identity crisis, that he was literally just behaving in ways that were really inappropriate to do in a relationship, to say the least. And I just love that they called him out on his BS. So it was a really interesting story. I will admit I had no idea what direction the story was going to go or what was happening. So that was really interesting and exciting. It's just the only thing I didn't like was the character. But like I said, I think that that was very intentional, and I think that it was a really well-written story that did exactly what it set out to do. The next story is Aggie by Lyle. What I really liked about this story was the main character, Everett Caulfield. I felt like he was a really well-developed character, especially for such a short story. I feel like we really got a good sense of who he is throughout the story and, the reasons behind his decision-making. And I just thought that the story felt really fleshed out and full considering how short it is. So in this story, the main character is looking for the Aggie, which the best way I could describe it would be it's like the Loch Ness Monster. And while he's doing that, his boat ends up kind of tilting over and he gets knocked out of it. And he ends up trying to find shelter, and he finds a cabin. And I can't tell you any more than that, but it's a very surprising ending. I definitely did not see that coming. I don't think anyone would see that coming. It was really strange, and I really enjoyed it. The next story is 9 Seconds by Marie McWilliams. This story is about a flight investigator who was investigating the disappearance of all of the passengers and crew on a plane that they just recovered. This story has a really weird premise. It reminds me a lot of Stephen King's The Langoliers and certain Twilight Zone episodes. I love horror stories that take place on planes. There's just something so disturbing about being so vulnerable, so high up in the air, and also, you know, planes are so small, and so it has this really claustrophobic feeling as well. But within this story, it's mostly about, you know, the passengers who disappeared and trying to figure out what happened to them. The flight investigator listens to a black box, and that's also kind of creepy as well, hearing, like, you know, the last thing that the pilots said before the plane went missing. The ending is the only part of the story I wasn't absolutely thrilled with. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. I just was kind of hoping for like a more supernatural explanation for what happened. Granted, technically it is a supernatural explanation, but I just was kind of looking for something like, oh, they entered another dimension kind of thing. But I did feel like it was, you know, a very ominous story, and that sort of carried the same creepy atmosphere and tone throughout the story. And it did have, you know, a satisfying explanation for what happened. And ultimately I felt like it was a really satisfying story with a very creepy premise. The next story is Last in a Long Line by Lydia Peever. I don't have a whole lot to say about this story. I thought that it was written really well, and I thought that the author did a really good job of making me care about the characters and care about what happens to them. I did think that the story was a little bit longer than it needed to be, and I also didn't feel like the ending was super satisfying, considering all of the build-up that was going on throughout the story. Basically, it's about a family that's vacationing somewhere, I don't remember, and they end up being kind of haunted by this ghost or some kind of supernatural entity. And I don't want to get into spoilers with the ending because it's literally the only part of the story that felt really unexpected, and it kind of feels like the whole story's building up to the ending, which just wasn't quite as, just didn't really hit the mark for me. But the author did do a good job of making me care about the characters, so that by the time we got to the end of the story, I did care about what happened to them, which is something that's not very easy to achieve in a short story, so I thought the author did a really good job with that. The next story is The Starlet Suite by R. St. Clair, and I think that this is my favorite story in the entire collection. So the story revolves around an aspiring starlet named Joni who is staying at the Hotel Paradiso, a super haunted hotel where lots of famous people have disappeared or been murdered horribly. And, you know, she's staying here because it's cheap, and she wants to go to this party where she can meet a bunch of famous people and try to make connections, and, you know, this is just like the cheapest place for her to stay. You know, as it goes in horror stories, obviously, like, the cheap place is obviously haunted, or, you know, something's terribly wrong with it. So that's what happens, and she ends up encountering some ghosts, and I can't really say too much more about what happens without getting into spoilers, but, you know, it's pretty obvious as soon as you find out, like, all the horrible things that happen in that hotel that she's gonna be bumping into some ghosts, and that's exactly what happens. This story is also just a really good exploration of what it means to have social media addiction and to be obsessed with gaining followers and gaining clout online. The next story is Last Road Trip by Slady Valheim. This story is about two stoner bros, I don't know how else to describe them besides stoner bros, who end up going to Area 51 to look for, you know, mystery and excitement, and they end up finding trouble. This story was very strange. It had a lot of body horror in it, and there's not a whole lot of plot to speak of. It really is just them like in the car, and then some really bizarre things start happening to them whenever they're in the car. But like I said, it had some really good body horror in it, some really gnarly description, and I thought that it was an interesting story, and the ending was a little bit bittersweet but also kind of funny. The whole story had a very subtle dark humor element to it throughout, and I really enjoyed it, and the way that it kind of tied into the ending and made the ending, even though it was very bleak and dark, it made the ending almost feel hopeful in a way. So I really liked that story and thought that it was a good addition to this collection. The next story is 665 by Lyall. This story is about a couple whose marriage is in trouble. The wife seems to either be somewhat possessed, There's stages of possession. There's fully possessed, somewhat possessed, possibly possessed, slightly possessed. She seems to fall along the lines of moderately possessed. They end up going to some remote place far away from their day-to-day lives in order to kind of reconnect. I thought that this story, a lot like the last story, had some really good moments of body horror in it. There was definitely some things in the story that grossed me out, and that's hard to do nowadays, especially in fiction. But yeah, there was definitely some gross things in this story, and I felt like the ending was really surprising, especially considering it was written in first person. I did not expect it to end that way, but the story had a very surprising ending that was really interesting and definitely one of the highlights of the story for me. The next story in this collection is Karma Always Comes Back by Kashay Warren. So this story is about a girl that's in a bad relationship with this guy who cheats on her, and she ends up wanting to break up with him, and she almost does, but then she's weak and she takes him back, or she entertains the idea of taking him back, and then her BFF is like, no girl, we're not doing this, and she does what every good best friend does when they realize that their friend is dating a fuckboy, and she kills him. And then the rest of this story is just like a weird oddball comedy almost, and that they're like trying to dispose of the body, but like the friend is just like got some major, almost like manic vibes to them. They're complete chaos, and they make things really difficult, more difficult than they should be. I really enjoyed this story a lot up until the ending. The ending was a little bit disappointing for me because I really enjoyed the dynamic between the best friend and the main character, and I wanted to see that resolved in a different way. I feel like had it been resolved in a different way, the story would have easily been one of my favorites in the collection, but as it was, I just didn't really like that ending a lot, and it kind of sucks because, like I said, I really enjoyed the story up until that ending. It just didn't do it for me. The next story is The Lords of Dusk by Jason White. This story starts off kind of similar to We're Not in Tamworth Anymore, where it's about a couple that's driving through a small town, their car ends up breaking down, and they end up stranded. The tension in this story comes from the fact that they're in danger. That the fact that the car mechanic is taking a long time fixing their car is suspicious, and there's lots of other things in this story that are suspicious and getting more and more suspicious all the time. The couple does eventually figure out that they're in danger and that they need to get out of there, and they end up making an escape attempt, and I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. I will just say that I felt like this story was really good. This story did a really good job of making me care about the characters, and I was actually surprised by how sad I felt at the ending. I'm not going to say any details about what happened to the characters. There's lots of sad endings that don't involve death, by the way, but it was just really sad and melancholic. It really surprised me by how moved I was, because I didn't realize that I cared so much about these characters, or maybe it's just the way that it was written that it made me care about them more than I even realized. But it was really sad and really beautiful, and I really liked this story. The last story in this collection is Head in the Sand by Wolfe. This is another story about a couple that goes on vacation and their relationship is kind of struggling. It's a very common theme in this collection. I didn't know that vacations were considered a part of couples counseling. Although, to be fair, I can understand how it's a lot easier to like someone when you're on a beach vacation in Hawaii. I pretty much like everyone a lot more when I'm in Hawaii, so that makes a lot of sense. Anyway, this couple is on a tropical beach. It's really crowded. The girl wants to go back to the hotel because she doesn't like the beach, and the boyfriend is just like had enough of her. They're about to start getting into some conflict, and then this other dude comes up to them and is like, hey, I know a secluded beach not far from here, which is super suspicious. I've seen this happen so many times in horror stories, the, hey, let me show you a nice, pretty secluded area to take your girl, that if this ever actually happened to me in real life, I would definitely think that I was about to be murdered. But these are characters in a story, and apparently they don't watch horror movies, so the dude's like, yeah, sure, that sounds fantastic. And they end up going to this secluded place. It's beautiful, it's everything he said it was gonna be, until it's not. So the guy Todd ends up being buried in the sand somehow. I'm not entirely sure how it happens because he doesn't intentionally bury himself in the sand, but I guess just the sand, the consistency is almost a little bit like quicksand, and he ends up just kind of slowly kind of sinking into the sand a little bit, but he's so relaxed and doesn't care until it comes time for him to have to dig himself out, and then something bad happens and he ends up trapped. And I won't say any more than that, other than the fact that the idea of being stuck with just your head protruding from the sand and unable to move is a terrifying feeling. I have intentionally buried myself in the sand before whenever I was a kid, and been in that stage where you're stuck, you're totally paralyzed and helpless and you need other people to dig you out. I don't know why as a child that's considered fun. Looking back on it, I'm that's terrifying. Anything could have gone wrong. I could have been stuck there. I could have drowned. But yeah, it's pretty scary thinking about it now, and particularly after having read this story. So I love this story. I thought that it was very creepy. Again, that feeling of just being immobile, being paralyzed and helpless is very, very unsettling. And I thought that the author did a really good job of exploiting that feeling and making the reader feel that. So overall, I give this collection 4 out of 5 stars. There was definitely some standout stories for me, particularly We're Not in Tamworth Anymore, the Starlet Suite, and then the closing story of this anthology I thought were all fantastic. And then I don't think there was any bad stories in this whole collection. I felt like there was definitely good writing throughout, and I felt like there was definitely a lot of interesting tropes that were used, some unexpected endings. But there was also a couple stories that had some endings that were disappointing, and a few of them that I felt like, even though if they were good stories, were a little bit too long, or had some faults in them that just made me not enjoy them quite as much. So 4 out of 5 stars. I highly recommend this anthology. I would definitely check it out. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On this channel, I post book reviews, writing advice, horror content, and vlogs. And I just edited a horror anthology called Roadkill 6 Texas Horror by Texas Writers. I'll include a link for this in the description box below if you want to check it out. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you later. Hey guys, it's Madison Estes. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about We're Not Home and little video bomber.